Before the headline, before the arrest, before the body. Cycles that kill. By now, you've probably seen it. A man on a gurney. Corrections officers, over an hour of failed attempts to find a vein. Tennessee officials eventually calling the entire thing off while the governor scrambles to figure out what comes next. The botched execution of Tony Carruthers has been all over your timeline for weeks, and the conversation has been loud. Was he guilty? Was the conviction fair? Should the state even be in the business of executing people, especially 30 years after? All of that is being argued somewhere on the internet right now. And I'm not here for any of it, because while everybody is debating Tony Carruthers, I could not stop thinking about a woman named Delois Anderson. And I need you to stop and think about her too. Delois was 43 years old. She worked at a bank during the day and took classes at night. She had a niece and two great-nieces living under her roof, and she served herself a plate of greens for dinner on the evening of February 24th, 1994, set her purse down, left her keys, and never came home. She was buried alive in a cemetery in Memphis. Her hands were tied, her body was placed at the bottom of a grave, and her son and his teenage friend were placed on top of her. But nobody is talking about her, and that is exactly why we are here. Welcome to Cycles That Kill. I'm Dr. Dylesia. This is episode 2. And today we are asking the question that the entire national conversation about this case has completely skipped. What created the conditions that put Delois Anderson in that grave? If you listened to episode 1, you already know who I am, so I'll keep this brief. If you're new here, welcome. You picked a great episode to start with. As I mentioned before, I'm Dr. Dylesia. I have a Master of Social Work, a Doctor of Social Work, and I am licensed as a clinical social worker in 8 states. My doctoral dissertation was focused entirely on mother-daughter trauma, a term I coined and have built nearly 30 clinical frameworks around. My specialty is working with women who have experienced patterns of absence, abuse, and neglect within their relationship with their mother. I mean, the kind of pain that when it goes uninterrupted moves from one generation to the next, oftentimes without anyone ever naming it. That is the lens through which I do everything, including this. This episode is different from episode 1 in one important way. With Mackenzie Shirilla, we had receipts, court documents, Netflix documentaries, prison phone calls, Natalie Shirilla's own words on camera. With Delois Anderson, we have almost nothing. And I want to be very upfront about that from the jump. What I'm going to do today is something called origin mapping, which I introduced in episode 1, but I want to clearly explain what it means for this episode specifically. Origin mapping is the practice of tracing a behavior or outcome back to the conditions that produced it. When the documented record is thin, which it is here, origin mapping uses what we know about the environment, the era, and how specific forms of trauma manifest in human behavior to make clinical assertions about what was likely true. Because the absence of documentation is not the absence of a story. It's just a story that nobody thought to ask about. But me, I'm always going to ask. So let me tell you about Delois before I tell you about the crime. Because in every piece of coverage that exists about this case, and there's not much, she is identified in one of 2 ways. Either as Marcelos's mother or as a victim, sometimes both in the same sentence. Delois Anderson was born January 15, 1951. She was 43 years old in 1994. A Black woman in North Memphis in 1994, who I told you earlier was spending her days at the bank and then going to school at night. That is not a woman who gave up. That is a woman who was actively trying to build something better. She lived in her home with her son Marcelos, her niece Leventhia, and Leventhia's 2 young daughters. She was, based on the available information, the anchor of that household. Marcelos was 21 years old, and he was, by all accounts, including the prosecution's own framing, a drug dealer. He was known to carry large amounts of cash. He wore expensive jewelry, including a diamond money clip. And according to trial testimony, he kept a considerable amount of cash hidden in the attic of Delois's home. In her attic. I want you to hold that detail because we're coming back to it. On the evening of February 24, 1994, around 9:00 p.m., Leventhia came home to an empty house. Delois's car was there, her purse was there, her keys were there, a pack of cigarettes and a lighter were in their usual spot in her bedroom. And it appeared she'd been interrupted while eating because food was also left in the bedroom. But she was gone. Police would later find out that Delois had driven a coworker home around 7:15, who was the last person to have seen her alive. What happened, according to trial testimony, is that men came to the house looking for Marcellos. Delois was there when they arrived. They forced her to call her son and tell him to come home. And when he got there with his 17-year-old friend Frederick Tucker, all three of them were taken at gunpoint. They were then driven to Mississippi. Marcellos and Frederick were shot, and then all three of them were driven back to Memphis and buried in Rose Hill Cemetery on Elvis Presley Boulevard in the grave of a woman named Dorothy Daniels, who would be buried the following day. Later, officials would be court-ordered to decenter or dig up Daniels' grave, where they would find the bodies of Delois, her son, and her son's friend Frederick buried beneath Daniels' casket under several inches of dirt and a piece of plywood. Court documents record that when Delois was pushed into that grave, she was screaming. The medical examiner determined that Delois died from asphyxia. The position of her body, dirt in her mouth and nose, trauma from the weight of the bodies placed on top of her. Her hands were bound behind her back and there was a red sock around her neck. Let me remind you, Delois was 43 years old, not too much older than many of us. And like most of us, she was trying to better herself, working full-time and taking classes. Yet she died at the bottom of a hole in the ground because of the world her son was living in. Now, the conviction of Tony Carruthers has been seriously contested. There was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. The case was built primarily on testimony from a paid informant who has since recanted. His co-defendant, James Montgomery, took an Alford plea, which is a special type of guilty plea where a criminal admits that the prosecution has enough evidence to likely result in a conviction, but officially maintains their innocence. Basically the equivalent of saying, oh shoot, you got me, but I'm not going to admit it. He received a 27-year sentence and was released in 2015, while Carruthers has been on death row ever since. DNA testing that could potentially answer outstanding questions has been repeatedly denied. I'm not here to relitigate this conviction. This is not what this episode is about. What I am here to do is to talk about the woman whose story has been reduced to 3 words in every headline: and his mother. So let's go back to the attic. And I need us to sit with what that means, because there are really only a few possibilities here and none of them are comfortable. Either Delois knew the money was there or she didn't. And if she didn't, then the question is how? Because the prosecution described Marcellos as someone who was visibly, obviously, flashily in the drug trade. Diamonds, large amounts of cash on his person. This was not a subtle operation. So what was Delois' relationship to all of it? Was she protecting her son? Was she afraid? Was she in denial? Was she participating in a version of the bargain that a lot of mothers in underserved communities like the one I'm from quietly make, where the money coming in is making survival possible, and asking too many questions feels more life-threatening than not asking? I don't know. And I want to be honest that I don't know. But I think the question itself is the point, because the question is the one that nobody has ever publicly asked. And not asking means we also never asked what she was carrying, what she'd been taught, and what she felt like her options actually were. And here's where I want to bring in the framework I introduced at the top of this episode: origin mapping. We have no documented information about Delois' upbringing. We do not know who her mother was. We do not know what her childhood looked like. And although we have some insight on what North Memphis looked like when she was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s as a Black girl in the South, we don't know what she was taught about loyalty, silence, and about what a mother's job is when her child is in trouble. But what we do know is the world she was in. And that world, it tells us a great deal. North Memphis in 1994 was a community being hollowed out in real time. Factory closures, decades of disinvestment, a poverty rate that had been climbing since the 1970s. By the time Delois Anderson was a young man, Memphis had one of the highest poverty rates of any major American city, and the burden of that poverty fell overwhelmingly on Black residents. Delois was born in 1951, which means she grew up in Memphis in the Jim Crow South. She came of age in the city where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, where just the night before he had stood with Black sanitation workers who were fighting for the basic dignities of fair pay and humane working conditions. That is the Memphis that Delois was shaped by. The world that taught her things about what survival requires, about what safety looks like, about who gets protected and who doesn't, about what a Black mother is supposed to do when the system was never designed with her in mind. And then the crack epidemic arrived. In the mid-1980s, when Marcellos would have been a teenager, Crack cocaine restructured the economic landscape of communities like North Memphis in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. The drug trade didn't just provide income in communities where legitimate income had been systematically removed. It became an entire social ecosystem. It had its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own consequences for people who stepped out of line. And it pulled in young men, especially young Black men with no fathers, which, based on everything the record shows us, appears to describe Marcello's. Now, here is the clinical assertion I want to make, and I'm labeling it as an assertion because we don't have documentation to confirm it, but it is grounded in what we know about this world, this era, and what origin mapping tells us about the patterns that move through generations. Delois was almost certainly a woman who had been taught that a mother's love is demonstrated through protection, through loyalty, through keeping the family together no matter what. That is not a pathology. That is a value system that was forged in a world where Black mothers had to be everything for their children because society was intentionally structured around failing them. Delois likely learned things like you protect your child, you don't put your child in the hands of institutions that have historically harmed people who look like your child. You keep the money quiet, you keep the trouble inside the walls, you manage it. That's probably what her mother taught her, and that's probably what her mother taught her. That is not weakness. That is a survival strategy that made sense in the environment it was designed for. The problem is that survival strategies don't always update when the environment changes. And when a strategy that was built for one kind of danger gets applied to a different kind of danger, the kind that carries a diamond money clip and keeps cash in your attic, the consequences, they can be fatal. I want to be careful here because I'm not saying that Delois caused her own death. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that the conditions that put her in a position of vulnerability, the loyalty, the silence, the management of a dangerous situation from inside the home, those conditions were not random. They were shaped by a world that gave her very few options, and by a set of beliefs about what a mother is supposed to do that she likely inherited from the women who raised her. That is a cycle, and it killed her. And what I'm describing is not specific to Delois. It's a pattern in a lot of families. Definitely mine, and it may live in yours. As we remember from the last episode, where we traced 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla's homicidal behavior back to her relationship with her parents, particularly her mother, origin mapping has 3 stages: the pain, the belief, the transfer. The pain is what a mother likely experienced in her own formation, what shaped her relational template. For a Black woman born in 1951 in Memphis, Tennessee, growing up in Jim Crow, coming of age in a city defined by economic abandonment and racial violence, a lot of that pain doesn't have to be speculated about. It's structural, it's historical, and it's deeply personal because it shows up in every thread of her upbringing since her caregivers feel it too. The belief is a survival conclusion she drew from that pain. And here's what I want to assert clinically about Delois. Based on what origin mapping tells us about women who were shaped in environments like hers, she likely believed that because of how she saw the mothers before her hold things down, it was her turn to do the same, to absorb, to manage quietly even if it was a risk. That asking for help from outside the family is a form of exposure that creates more danger than it resolves. That loyalty to your child, even when your child is doing something criminal, is what love looks like. Because that is what love looked like in the world that she came from. The transfer is the direct line from that belief to what she taught Marcello's, possibly only implicitly, about how life works and how those teachings impacted his decisions about how he'd navigate his. Here's what I think the transfer looks like in this case. A young man who grows up watching his mother quietly protect him and hold the walls up without asking for anything in return. That young man learned something about what love costs mothers. From that belief, Marcello's likely decided that home was a container, that his mother's love and loyalty were unconditional. And that decision, it didn't announce itself all at once. It was built insidiously over 21 years. And it probably started small. Maybe Marcello's got in a fight at school, and instead of sitting him down and asking what his role was, Delois just went and got him. No conversation, no consequence, just presence, protection, because that is what she knew love looked like. Maybe a teacher called home about his behavior and Delois listened politely, hung up the phone, and never brought it up again. Not because she didn't care, but because confronting him felt like choosing the school over her child. Maybe there were moments where she saw things she didn't fully ask about. Money that didn't add up, hours of the night he finally surfaced that didn't make sense, friends she didn't recognize, and she kept it to herself, held it internally without naming it out loud. Because naming it would make it real, and making it real would mean having to do something about it. And doing something about it might mean losing her son. And from all of that, Marcellos learned in the accumulation of those moments that his mother's love had no ceiling, no floor, no limits. But love, y'all, without limits is not just beautiful, it's dangerous. Because a young man who has never felt the boundaries of his mother's love does not learn what it means to stop. And because of that, he just keeps going farther and farther until one night, the people who want what he has show up at his home. And his mother just happens to be there when they do. Now, before you start to resent Marcellos or begin to fear the young men in your life who navigate the world like him, I want to calm your central nervous system by pointing out that this was not likely a conscious choice. It's improbable that Marcellos sat down one day and thought, my mother will die for me. But what he did do was keep money in her attic. And she, whatever she knew, whatever she didn't, she was there. I'm not blaming her. I want to say that clearly one more time. I'm tracing a cycle. And the cycle says what a mother is taught about what loving her son requires of her gets passed down to her son in the things she endures without naming, in the things she protects without questioning, and in the decisions he decides to make because he feels invincible. I keep coming back to this. Delois was working at a bank and going to school at night. It's clear she was trying to build something. But contrary to her efforts, she was also, in all likelihood, managing something she did not fully know how to name or how to get out of. That is what an uninterrupted cycle looks like. A woman doing everything right on the surface while swallowing something fearful that's also being built, often with even more horsepower underneath. And that thing, that empire, that operation, that attic enterprise that was never named by her, got her buried alive. I want to talk about something that goes beyond Delois Anderson's individual story, because her erasure from this narrative is not an accident, it's a pattern. When Black mothers become victims of violence, especially when the violence is connected to the activities of a male family member, they often disappear from the story. They become context. They become the setting for someone else's plot. Delois appears in court documents as Marcellos' mother. She appears in news coverage as a detail in the story of a man on death row. Until now, nobody has publicly hypothesized about how she was raised. Nobody has asked what she was carrying, and nobody has done her origin map. And that has cost us the ability to learn, to interrupt, to see the cycle before it completes itself and harms mothers like her. Not just from my clinical work, but from growing up in a hood just like North Memphis, I know that Delois Anderson's story is not rare. The specific details are hers alone, but the shape of it, a mother whose unexamined beliefs about loyalty and protection created a vulnerability that cost her everything, that shape is familiar. I've sat as a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister, a niece, a cousin, with women who are carrying versions of that story. Women who are managing dicey situations from inside their homes. Women who were taught that a good mother doesn't expose her family, that she sticks beside her son no matter what. But different from most family members, instead of taking on the baggage, the gamble of that, and passing it on to my kids, I've always wondered, where did you learn that? Who taught you that this is what love requires? And the answer has always led to a mother, and behind her, another mother, and behind her, a world that gave them no other framework. That is what this show is for. In this specific case, not to assign blame to a woman who is already surviving impossible conditions, but to name the unnamed, to ask the unasked, because the cycle cannot be interrupted until it can be seen. And it cannot be seen if we keep treating the women at the center of these stories as footnotes. Delois Anderson was not a footnote. She was a woman, a mother, and a daughter who was shaped by something, and what she was shaped by shaped her son. And her son's world, it took her life. That is a cycle, and it deserved to be named 30 years ago. Coming up on Cycles That Kill, we'll continue going where the cycle leads. If this episode hit you somewhere real, if you recognize something in the story of a woman who protected too much and was never taught why, I want to hear from you. Share this episode, leave a comment, or better yet, leave a review. And come back next time. I'm Dr. Dylesia. This is Cycles That Kill. See you soon.